$100 in the house, and I'm going to do this again. You never know what happens.
Oh yeah, I have. Yeah, my mother taught me that. I'm going to start the webinar, even though Richard's not with us yet, because I want to make sure.
But physically, you're okay. Otherwise,
I didn't even know about it till I got home and realized I didn't have my wallet. And then the guy at Basics was terrific, and they have surveillance, and he was able to go back through it, and we could actually see me doing the transaction with him at the counter, and that there was no one around me until I started to walk out, stopped to look at something, and this guy came behind me, stopped for a minute, and then walked out the door. And that must have been it.
wow.
And my bag was open.
Oh,
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Lisa, I'm sorry to hear this. Where did this happen?
In Basics, Basics hardware on Broadway and 84th. The owner was very upset.
Oh, sure.
sure.
They're nice people in there, yeah.
They are.
So we are live streaming and we are recording, just for everybody's FYI. Richard has now joined us, although in silhouette. And but I don't see the presenters unless either Ajka or Sylvia are the presenters. I thought it was going to be, oh, Nabila's with us. Oh, good. Okay, there she is. Hi. I don't think we have a quorum of the Land Use Committee at this point. Well, maybe we do. Let's see.
Well,
1, 2.
1, 2, 3, 4, 6.
We have
You on the
quality.
committee, Mark?
I have to call up the, give me 1 second. I have to call up my little list of who's on the committee.
We may not have quantity, but we have quality.
Jeanette and Paige and Ethel aren't present.
Yeah.
Paige sent us a note saying she was going to join us about 6:30, about, whenever she finished, she had a 5:30.
Yep.
Well, so she'll
Okay,
join
I
us.
have a 7:30 co-op board meeting, another Zoom meeting, so I had to leave a little bit before 7:30.
I think we'll be finished by then, I hope.
I'm hoping.
11. There are 11 members of land use, and how many of us are here?
Are they really?
Yeah.
And Jeanette just joined.
Okay.
We're
So,
fine.
okay.
So you have a quorum.
Very good.
Okay. All right, so Nabila, educate us on what's being planned, what you're trying to accomplish, and what, if anything, it means to the Upper West Side.
Yeah, sounds good. Hi, everyone. It's been a while, so it's good to see all of you again. So today I'm going to talk about zoning for coastal flood resiliency, and let me just share my screen.
Oh, I need to, hang on, I need to let you do that.
Okay, yeah,
Sorry.
it's okay.
1 second. You should now be able to do so.
Okay, here we go. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Great. So so most of you are probably familiar with the fact that there's a very small portion of CB7 that is affected by the floodplain. And so a lot of this, this is a citywide text, so a lot of it applies to mostly other parts of the city. The areas where this applies to CB7 are near, Waterline Square and Riverside Park. So, the buildings that would have these options are already built out. But this is informational. I'm going to go through what the actual proposal is so that you all are familiar with it. And if you have any specific questions, I can talk through that as well. So just keep that in mind, because a lot of this, doesn't necessarily apply to CB7 just because of the limited applicability of the floodplain. Okay. So ZICFR, Zoning for Coastal Flood Resiliency, was referred out on October 19th, and the proposal introduces updates to zoning resolution sections related to flood resiliency measures and options. So just to begin with some background here, when we're analyzing the city's coastal risk, we tend to focus on the area that FEMA designates as a high-risk flood zone. So that's the area that has a 1% chance of risk of being flooded every year. But in 2012, Hurricane Sandy woke us up to a more widespread risk by inundating well beyond the 1% area. So the map in the middle you see on the slide there. Close to half of the properties that are technically classified as being at moderate risk of flooding or having a 0.2% chance of flooding were inundated during Sandy. So in the two areas combined, almost 1 million New Yorkers live at risk of being flooded by a coastal storm. And with climate change, the floodplain will continue to expand. So by the 2050s, today's moderate risk flood zone will likely be high risk, as you can see in the red on the map to the right. So as you all know, the city has 520 miles of coastline. And because this is a citywide proposal, there are aspects of it that don't necessarily apply to Manhattan buildings, but the city has a very diverse floodplain and building stock. So this proposal offers flexibility and options to help make it relevant to buildings throughout the 5 boroughs. So after Hurricane Sandy, many buildings were severely damaged and had to be reconstructed and brought into compliance with the New York City Building Code. So regulations governing buildings in the flood zone are located in Appendix G of the Building Code, which details flood resilient construction requirements. So compliance with these rules is generally required for new buildings constructed in the flood zone and for existing buildings in the flood zone that are being significantly altered. I just want to quickly explain what sorts of things are required through Appendix G. So regulations for buildings in the floodplain depend on their location in the flood zone. They also depend on building uses and where these uses are situated in relation to the design flood elevation, DFE, which is the blue dashed line here. The DFE is the height that floodwaters could be expected to rise, plus additional elevation for protection. So for residential buildings, in Appendix G, all living spaces have to be located at or above the design flood elevation, and any space below that must be wet flood-proofed, meaning it's designed to allow water to flow in and out in a flood event. So those wet flood-proofed spaces can only be used for parking or storage or access. These residential buildings can't have any spaces below ground. And then for non-residential or mixed use buildings, those can be designed with the same wet floodproofing methods, but they also have the option to dry floodproof and locate some uses below the design flood elevation. So dry floodproofing means meeting specific design and material requirements so that water can't enter the building during a flood event. So this is typically costlier because you're using very specific materials to prevent water from entering the building. But the strategy allows uses to be located close to the sidewalk level, which sort of helps maintain an active ground floor. So these Appendix G regulations became widely applicable soon after Hurricane Sandy and posed conflicts with the zoning resolution, which led to the 2013 flood text. And that flood text provided zoning flexibility for buildings in the flood zone so that resiliency construction requirements in Appendix G could be more easily met. These are temporary zoning rules that were adopted on an emergency basis, and they removed many zoning barriers to resilient construction, to things like bulk and use regulations, making those more flexible. However, these rules are set to expire, and if they're not made permanent, it could hinder the protection of existing vulnerable buildings, as well as disincentivize resiliency measures in new construction. So that's why we're here today. So the Department of City Planning conducted years of research and outreach, which uncovered a lot of issues that communities are still facing post-Sandy and post the 2013 flood text. So the proposal now is to make many of those provisions added after Sandy permanent and to expand and refine them so communities have even greater flexibility for adaptation. So ultimately, zoning for coastal flood resiliency will help those living and working in the floodplain to reduce damage from future coastal storms, be resilient in the long term, and potentially help save on flood insurance costs. It would also assist with disaster recovery from future disasters, including the present situation with COVID-19. So the existing flood text zoning rules helped a lot of buildings meet Appendix G requirements. However, we did hear during the outreach process that these rules weren't enough in certain situations. So for example, our current rules mostly assisted buildings that can be physically elevated, such as detached houses. This in particular is not helpful to many buildings in the flood zone in Manhattan. Attached homes and multifamily buildings weren't well addressed since they have to evacuate spaces below the design flood elevation and relocate them on top of the structure. And that's a retrofit strategy that requires more flexibility. Also, businesses weren't really addressed as they do need high visibility from sidewalks, but also because many heavily rely on cellars or being at grade for operations. Okay, I'm gonna now get into the nitty-gritty of the proposal. So after our long process of studying the floodplain and engaging with stakeholders, we were able to establish 4 overarching goals that help move from Sandy recovery to a longer-term resiliency strategy. So one is applicability. We want to allow buildings to prepare for flooding, even if they aren't located in what FEMA currently determines to be the highest risk flood zone. So that's that 1% zone. 2 is flexible bulk regulations. So providing the option to raise occupiable spaces a little higher than the current flood level that FEMA projects, because we've seen higher flood levels already and expect the risk to grow in the future. 3 is incremental adaptation. So we want owners to be able to invest in resiliency incrementally so it's more affordable over time. For example, allowing buildings to move mechanical equipment to a higher elevation without triggering a requirement to raise or fully floodproof the entire building. And then 4, future recovery. We need a way for the city to be nimbler in responding to future events that might require rebuilding homes or other forms of recovery. So now for each goal, I'll present a set of strategies that help achieve them, and then go over a selection of regulations that we're proposing. And important to note is that these proposed regulations maintain optionality, so owners can opt into these resiliency measures to help them meet Appendix G requirements, or, you know, if Appendix G requirements are not triggered for their building, this will still give them the option to make their buildings more resilient. None of these rules are mandated, and many of them exist in today's flood text. So goal 1 is where we speak to where the proposed zoning text would apply. The proposal expands the applicability of the current text to a broader set of buildings that are also exposed to flooding. So you can see on the map here that any lot located within either the high risk or moderate risk floodplains would be allowed to use the proposed special options for resilient building design. And then this is the applicability to CB7. So as you can see, the blue is the 1% annual chance. So this is the high risk area. And then the yellow is the moderate risk, which is the 0.2% annual chance floodplain. So again, limited applicability. A lot of this is Riverside Park, and there are coastal resiliency studies and measures that that apply to Riverside Park, but those are managed by the Department of Parks and Recreation. Okay. So goal 2, this section illustrates options that would be available only if a building fully meets or exceeds Appendix G of the building code. And these are split into a few separate strategies. So starting with the building envelope, the proposal would allow building owners to physically elevate habitable spaces and other building support features above expected flood elevations so that they're safer in the long term. So currently, the 2013 flood text already allows maximum height to be measured from the design flood elevation. Today, building heights can be bumped to 10 or 12 feet, depending on the building's use and zoning district. But this makes it a highly complex framework because the applicability depends upon the flood elevation level, and slight topography changes can lead to inconsistencies there. So the proposal seeks to clean that up and would make these height allowances more consistent and equitably distributed by allowing heights to be measured from a new reference plane that can be placed up to 10 feet above grade in the 1% floodplain and up to 5 feet in the 0.2% floodplain. So this would encourage building owners to address long-term climate change and allow for lower insurance costs and usable spaces at grade. Okay, so floor area exemptions. The proposal would allow existing floor area exemption for spaces that are wet floodproofed to apply to both existing and new buildings, since these spaces pursuant to Appendix G regulations can only be used for parking, storage, and building access. Under the current rules, this exemption only applies to existing buildings, so the proposal is just to allow this for new buildings as well. Okay, so This slide is showing you the current floor area exemption rules for dry flood-proofed spaces. And there are two sets of rules currently. On your left, there's a provision that applies to existing buildings, which could exempt the entire dry flood-proofed space. So if you've dry flood-proofed that entire space, it's exempted from floor area. On the right, you can see a rule that applies to new and existing buildings, which allows any space to be exempted from floor area if more than half of the floor is below the flood level. So essentially the cellar. And the problem with this cellar exemption system currently is that it allows full floors to be entirely exempted without actually requiring the building to comply with resiliency standards. And so that has created a loophole where you can get floor area exempted, but you haven't really met any resiliency standards. Secondly, it has encouraged sort of squished ground floors with low ceilings and sunken ground floors, which are really vulnerable. And they make ground floor spaces less useful and marketable. So ultimately, these two existing exemptions have ended up promoting buildings that are out of scale and ground floors that, you know, are less effective for active uses. So this is the proposal that would help change this and close out the loophole. So basically what the proposal would do is modify these regulations to reduce the amount of floor area that can be exempted to instead only allow the first 30 feet of a space that is dry flood proofed to be exempted from floor area, provided that the space is used for non-residential uses. So this would help encourage active uses close to the sidewalk level and to promote a safe and lively pedestrian environment while making sure that the resulting buildings are not out of scale. So in addition, the proposal would require a set of streetscape requirements to improve the ground floor level design if a building was in fact taking advantage of the floor area exemption if they were flood proofing below the design flood elevation. Okay, so goal 3. The set of provisions located within this goal are what we call partial resiliency strategies that will help building owners to undertake incremental steps towards resiliency without requiring sites to fully meet Appendix G. So we learned that raising mechanical equipment, which is often located below grade within cellars, is the first and most cost-effective step to making buildings more resilient. The proposal would continue to allow the relocation of equipment and enable more options for their placement above the flood level, either on top of roofs or in a separate structure, by considering mechanical equipment as permitted obstructions. So as shown in the picture, this is particularly relevant for housing campuses and a recommendation that came out from the outreach process and coordination with NYCHA and HPD on their resiliency work. So the proposal would also enable different types of flood protection measures to be implemented. This would include allowances for flood panels and landscaped berms to be considered permitted obstructions in open areas. It would also allow spaces used for the storage of panels to be exempted from floor area to enable on-site storage. And lastly, zoning generally doesn't allow waterfront yards or required visual corridors to be raised to account for flood risk. The proposal would offer more flexibility for the grading of these areas and would facilitate resiliency measures such as soft shorelines. Okay. So now I'll speak about our final goal, which is different from the previous ones in that these rules would mostly apply not just in the floodplain, but on a citywide level. So these are things that would apply to CB7 as well. So Sandy showed us how a storm's effects can go beyond the floodplain, especially regarding issues with our energy grid. So the proposal would allow power systems, including generators, solar energy systems, fuel cells, batteries, to be considered permitted obstructions in open areas across all zoning districts to facilitate their installment. In addition, to ensure that all areas of the city can easily provide ADA access, the proposal would classify both ramps and lifts as permitted obstructions in all required open areas to facilitate accessible design. So Hurricane Sandy and other storms throughout the country have exposed difficulties facing nursing home residents in areas of high risk flooding because there's a lot of risk in evacuating residents of nursing homes. So the proposal would prohibit the development of new nursing homes within the 1% floodplain, which is the high risk floodplain, as well as other selected geographies that are likely to have limited vehicular access during a storm event. Existing facilities would still be able to conduct enlargements for modest improvements, including those that would help with resiliency. And lastly, Sandy showed us that a lengthy process to update zoning regulations can slow disaster response. The proposal would make certain recovery provisions available to be enabled quickly following future disasters. And some of these provisions would be implemented now to help address the COVID-19 pandemic and its associated economic effects. So this is the conclusion of the proposal. And this is just the timeline. Next steps, the citywide text amendment is following ULURP. And so CB resolutions are due by December 28th. And more information about the project, including an annotated version of the zoning text, as well as a one-pager, can be found on our website. So thank you so much for your time, and do let me know if you have any questions.
Who is recognizing?
Richard,
Louisa.
yeah.
Louisa.
Actually, Nabila, maybe it makes sense to stop screen sharing so we can see each other.
Yeah, sure. Let me. Here we go.
There you go.
Okay. Did I see Louisa's hand? No?
Yes.
Yes? Okay. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Two questions. The first one, when you said that you want to put in something that would accelerate zoning regulations in the case of emergencies such as a pandemic, what kind of zoning regulations are you talking about? And would that kind of get rid of ULURP? How would that work? Would it just go right over ULURP and the whole review process?
Sure. So, yes, let me, I just want to make sure I have the correct information here. So, there are two items that ZICFR is proposing to help with the pandemic response in the longer term. So one, and this is what I'm talking about. So one is giving more time for non-conforming uses to come back. As you may know, the existing rule is that if you are a non-conforming, if a building with a non-conforming use, if that use is left vacant for 2 years, then you can no longer bring back that same use.
Right.
So it would allow for that flexibility. And then two, we'd be giving more time for applications that come to the City Planning Commission that may be running out of the 10-year limit to complete their plans of construction. So it's important to note that the city is still operating under the mayor's emergency order, and that these were the items that we identified that may need more time beyond what the executive order can give. So we're taking the opportunity to add this flexibility now in ZICFR, since it is a citywide text amendment and already going to all of the community boards and borough presidents and borough boards for review.
Okay, so it would not be new zoning. It would be written in now of just extending time limits. Okay,
Right.
I have another question. Just when you mentioned electrical facilities and et cetera, does that also include screening? Because very often permitted obstructions must have screening.
I don't know what the screening provisions are specifically for these sort of electrical facilities that would be permitted obstructions. So I'll look into that and get back to you. That might just be a detail that's more specifically noted in the zoning text.
Okay, thank you.
Kelly. Unmute.
Yeah, so one question and then one endorsement of one aspect. For goal 2, you mentioned streetscape provisions, but there were no specifics. Are there specifics worked out already?
Yes, so there are a variety of streetscape provisions and options. I just, for the sake of time, I just didn't bring them up, but they're things like transparency requirements, more specific sort of streetscape design requirements like fenestration and different building materials, things like that. But I can send more details if you would like.
I think this group historically is very interested in that. Okay. Second is an endorsement, but just a little background. I serve as team chief of the community emergency response team, and we were chosen to be a part of a citywide group at John Jay to deal with medical and special needs center in case for Sandy and for other disasters. What we found after planning out the whole building on how we're going to handle everything, we went outside and realized that there were no accessible ramps or lifts on the outside. So all we planned on the inside was for naught, because no one would able to get there without using an elevator and some other trips. So I strongly endorse having acceptable restrictions on ramps and lifts in these buildings that are built. It's crucial. Hopefully they can be at least obstructive as possible and aesthetically pleasing, but they very often need to be there. So that's just an endorsement for that aspect.
Roberta, and then Ethel.
I have a question about the ULURP. You said that the committee boards have to respond by December 28th of this month.
Mhm.
So we have a problem because our steering meeting was last night. We don't have a full board meeting until January 5th. So whatever
That's
the,
okay.
We raised that with Nabil, and it's okay if we get it in early in January. Nothing's going to
Okay.
happen or move before then.
Yep. Yeah, we already discussed it, and it's fine. We're aware that CB7 will be submitting theirs in January.
If I could just jump in on that theme, I'm sorry to jump the line, but tomorrow morning is the borough board vote. So one of the things we should talk about later on is what the borough, I just received like 20 minutes before the meeting started, the borough board's proposed resolution. And so we should talk a little bit about that too, but go ahead with the line of comments first, and then we'll talk about that.
Okay, Ethel?
Thanks. I have 3 questions, 2 of which are very short. The first one is this the first time that the word squished has been used in the zoning text? There are those who may know more, but I would be very interested to know the precedent for that. And you know that squished has a very specific meaning. It has to do with softness underfoot, often as in the case of mud and so on. I'm just suggesting that you consider that, and I would love to know if it's the first time. Okay, and maybe you do know, Nabila, but if not, I'm mentioning it with great seriousness. The second is, I couldn't quite tell when I was looking at the map, and but can you tell me when you included, which I guess is major for Board 7, the vulnerability of Riverside Park as being, if I'm correct, the most significant potential place for susceptibility to flooding? Is it all of Riverside Park in Board 7, as well as extending up into, up to 155th Street, or does the grade change, or what are we talking about there? That's my second question. The third one is more, maybe I missed some of it, but when you described the awareness and the inclusion in this text of the pandemic and its effects, I guess, as being considered here, of course, that's a very big point. And I just wonder if you could give 1 or 2 examples of what we now know are some of the effects or difficulties that we're experiencing in the pandemic that might be relevant in what you have already written. So that's a bigger question, but if you could give some small indication of that. So it's really number 2 and number 3 that I'm asking, and I think, it could, I hope, answered quickly, and thank you.
Sure. So the term squished was just used for presentational purposes. That's not actually going into the text. It was really just to explain how under the current rules, where if you are dry flood proofing below the design flood elevation, you can get that floor area exempted. And basically an unintended consequence of that is that what building owners will do is they'll sort of lower the ceilings to get that exempted area, to get as much of that as possible. And then you have sort of a low scale ground floor, which isn't a very useful, active, or marketable space. So that was just why I used the term squished.
That's great. Okay, yeah.
So
sort of the opposite of the spaces in the 2 talls that are elevated.
Yeah,
right.
That's true.
Right. It's not a defined term.
No.
No, not a term. And as for the map, so the map that I showed you, and what I'll actually do is let me show you on, because you guys will be able to actually access this and play around with it. It's on our community district profiles website. I'll put the link in the chat here. So let me show you what I'm talking about. Okay. Okay, so here's the map for CB7, and you can sort of toggle and you can go to other community boards to compare. But I'm just gonna zoom in here. So this blue and yellow here is where it's applicable. So you can see that the further up we go to Riverside, the grade does change.
Right, that's what I was wondering.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's not, so the rest, like the northern parts of Riverside Park are not in the high risk flood zone. But Riverside Park South, you can see there's definitely.
So just lastly, being parochial for a moment, within Board 7, and then looking at this map, the high vulnerability is at the southern part of Riverside Park. Am I correct? Roughly up into the 60s and 70s. I'm looking at what you have. And then do we move up with a different degree of vulnerability, but within, I'm being parochial, back the boundary of Board 7 and then Riverside Park, it's not all of it within Board 7, right? No. Because the grade changes also.
Yeah, so let me zoom out.
But at least in terms of what to address, that the vulnerability or is in the middle to southern part, I guess, looking at that. It's also, by the way, among other things, maybe where the extended pier is into the water. So, okay, thank you. Yes, I think that's helpful in terms of just do things for within Board 7. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Nabila, I have a couple of questions. You mentioned that there could be permitted obstructions by moving mechanical equipment anywhere on the lot. Is that literally anywhere? I mean, if it's open space, if it's
no. So there are much more specific provisions tied to that allowance where it'll have to be like a certain amount of feet from the building, things like that. So there are specifics tied to where mechanical space could be located if not within the building. I can get you those details if you would like them. I just didn't include them in the presentation.
No, if what you're contemplating is relocating outside somewhere on the lot, I assume that doesn't apply really in our district.
No, it doesn't. Yeah, a lot of that. So the mechanical equipment in the open space that really applies to places like NYCHA campuses where you have a lot of buildings and you do have a lot of open space, which, you know, it just makes it easier to not have.
Theoretically, it could apply to Fordham or Lincoln Center or Columbia.
Yes, theoretically.
Well, what about Amsterdam houses, which is in, that seems to me in terms of NYCHA, because that's in the area that you showed originally of the, southern part.
No.
Maybe. Okay.
No, it's not in
it's further east, I think, too.
Yeah, it is further east.
That's why maybe it isn't. Yes. Okay.
But what is the rationale if a building is not in the floodplain? What is the rationale of enlarging the definition of permitted obstruction?
It's just if they're not in the floodplain, but they do want the ability to to have a more flood resilient building, it's an allowance for that where there may be sites that are more constrained and can't relocate the mechanical space within the building and would have to do it in an open space.
Is there any practical possibility that some institution on the Upper West Side would do that?
I mean, realistically and honestly,
Right.
probably not, just because, CB7 is fortunate in being a very low risk area, mostly. So I do think it's a little unlikely. I think areas that will take advantage of this provision will be NYCHA campuses, on the Lower East Side, and places like that where it is a much higher risk and they do have more constraints with their buildings.
Any other questions, comments? Paige.
Thank you. This is amazing. And I think the improvements you've made since 2013 are great. I'm just relieved that hopefully we never have to review any project. But the problem is we're a bunch of copycats. And if one person can do it, another developer may try. And I just caution a few things. I don't know if you have an answer for them, but basically the idea of changing the ground floor height I think it was in your goal 2 and 3, where you need to raise the floor. It doesn't impact our district, but it does give, you call it a cellar, but technically that is the basement and there's a cellar underneath. And I would, just to help my colleagues in other historic districts, clarify that definition if it's not already done, because I think that's open to abuse. People will want to raise their building and use that as an excuse to jack their building up higher. The other concern I have is, everything is ramped up. And when I remember getting involved with the AIA and others in 2013, we looked to Holland as ways of bridging things and creating berms. For instance, I worked on a parking lot and we created a massive bump, a speed bump to prevent the water from coming in Lower Manhattan. But I'm worried when you show an example of how to do something that you're eliminating potential creativity. And one of them you might consider is you go up and then you go down. So in other words, you raise the floodplain level within the limit where the building is safe, but you don't actually change the floor level inside the building. Those examples are many. And then the last one I have is the LPC and DOT. I find they are always making problems for themselves. And I'm concerned about DOT just in general, because they're very picky about recreating stoops, for instance, on the Upper West Side, distance of tree pits. And I think maybe it's in the bigger document, but I would ask that get clarified in terms of the DOT requirements for some of these things. And the same thing with LPC, because LPC, unlike DOT, is based on precedent. So if it can happen in Greenwich Village, it's going to happen in the East 50s or NYCHA or whatever. And I guess my last comment is about relocating mechanical equipment, because this one is troubling. And I'm thinking of a current project on 96th Street, the Children's Museum. And when you start stacking a lot of equipment on a roof, it is unsightly and also disturbs the neighbors, the noise, the appearance, maintenance, etc. So I don't know if there's language you can put in to protect existing neighbors, because I'm sure there's going to be another revision to this. And lastly, I want to make a plug for one of our community board members. Peter Sampton has, and I don't know if your office got a copy, but has done a report called The Gates of New York, which is a remarkable exercise looking at how to control the flooding outside of the island before it actually reaches the shores. So sorry for this, but this is a topic that really I'm interested in. I think it's great, but I think better definitions would help the design professional planners and frankly, the developers. Thank you.
Thanks, Paige. So I'll respond to a few of these, and I'll also just note, any of these concerns and recommendations you should definitely include in the resolution. But one thing I'll say about the ground floor height and the cellar situation you brought up. So what I was referring to there is when you have a residential building that has to meet Appendix G requirements, meaning they have to wet floodproof below the design flood elevation. Basically, so for residential buildings, there's no cellar allowed. If you're in a high risk or moderate risk flood zone, you can't even have a cellar, and the use that's below the design flood elevation is limited to accessing the building, to storage, or to parking. For non-residential and mixed use buildings, floor area can be exempted under the new provision. Floor area can be exempted up to 30 feet only if you have fully dry flood proofed below the design flood elevation. Currently, the rule is actually more flexible and is creating loopholes where people aren't dry flood proofing, but still taking advantage of the floor area exemption. So this is actually, the proposed rule is actually closing that loophole. And the allowable height now is really minimal, where if you are required to relocate, your residential use from, if it's sitting below or close to the design flood elevation, you actually need to move that space up. It's giving slight height allowances, 10 feet in the 1% floodplain and 5 feet in the 0.2%, to allow owners to be able to actually relocate that use for their buildings.
Mark, you want to tell us what the borough board plans to do?
Okay.
Sure, but Jeanette has her hand up first.
Oh, I'm sorry, Jeanette. Unmute.
I'm sorry, I had to go, and this is really an interesting proposal that's building on what has been done before, and I'm looking forward to going on the DCP site and reading it. So thank you very much. I'm sorry, everybody. I really have to go.
Yeah, we'll have a
Our next
chance,
meeting.
between today and the time the full board meets, if we look at the site and if we have any additional things, we can just change the resolution on
Of
consent.
course.
Excellent.
Thank you. Good night,
care,
everybody.
Lizzie.
Bye, Louise.
Bye-bye.
Jeanette.
Okay, so thank you. I think that, this seems very reasonable and well thought out. However, I'm really quite perplexed because to me, resiliency isn't just about better accommodating the next 100-year flood or 10-year flood. And many of the measures you're proposing, kind of feels like a DOB type action to really flood proof and make these buildings, better able to accommodate floods. And what I'd love to see is city planning more focused on preventing floods. And in that case, I would think our community up on a hill, a higher type topography could be making measures to improve our drainage system so that our new construction isn't draining into the lower parts. And so I just find it a little perplexing that the city planning's addressing this is all focused on when a flood happens, how to try to have less damage versus thinking about development in the city and new development, for instance, new development being self-containing so that any runoff or sewage or whatever that's happening is more efficient or is taken care of, which existing or new catch basins that aren't combined sewer outflows. And it just feels like I'd like to see more proactive. I'm a little disappointed in that part, but what you're presenting looks good. Thank you.
Sure, and I'll just quickly say that, the Department of City Planning, we're keepers of the zoning. So this is sort of our part in flood resiliency measures. It doesn't mean that there aren't other agencies in the city that are looking at coastal flood protection. And, what we do is work on the zoning, and the zoning deals with the building stock. And so you're correct in that this proposal really is focused on that. But there are other agencies that are working on this in other ways and addressing climate change issues. So you're right. This is one piece of the puzzle, but this is what city planning is able to do within the zoning.
Mark?
Thanks. So the resolution that I got literally half an hour before this meeting started which is the one that'll be presented at Borough Board tomorrow morning, has an approval with 11 call outs for potential changes. And I'll try to read them quickly or summarize them quickly. Very few of them, as you will have already ascertained, pertain to Community Board 7, except for buildings 3 and 4 of what used to be Riverside Center, now Waterline Square. Number one, though, is sort of up our alley in one sense. So number one is within historic districts, require special permit approval from city planning for any new building to utilize the text amendment with proper notification to community boards and the borough president, and ultimately approval of the use of these devices by the LPC. Number two is within special zoning districts, and we have a couple of those, require special permit approval from city planning for any new building to utilize the text amendment, again with notice and so forth. Number three is for new buildings along primary streets in commercial districts, require dry flood proofing without any zoning exemptions. Number four, for existing buildings along primary streets in commercial districts, limit height increases due to exempted ground floor area related to dry flood proofing to 1 floor. Number five is for new buildings outside of primary streets in commercial districts, require wet flood proofing or dry flood proofing without zoning exemptions. Number six is for existing buildings, limit reference plane to equal the flood resistant construction elevation. Sorry. I'm very popular with solicitors today. For existing buildings, limit reference plane to equal the flood resistant construction elevation according to the New York City Building Code. 7 is for new buildings, eliminate the reference plane provision and instead continue to measure building height from the curb level. Number 8 is for small property owners who are seeking or are required to comply with flood proofing provisions. DCP must work with other relevant agencies to create or identify sufficient funding streams for these owners to implement the measures. With respect to permitted obstructions in required yards, courts, and open spaces, that is only applicable to residential districts in R1 through R5, which is not us at all, right? Number 10 is clearly define primary street frontages in commercial districts where dry floodproofing provisions would apply, and restrict the definition of severe disaster to natural disasters related to flooding and purposes of this text amendment. And 11 is in relation to the concurrent Governor's Island rezoning. There's a bunch of provisions related to Governor's Island. So those are the 11 things that the Borough Board accumulated, I assume, from previous resolutions passed by the other 11 community boards. So there's two things. One is, do we want to include any of those things? I was sort of guessing that the historic district one and the special zoning district ones might be relevant to us. But the other is that tomorrow morning I will have to cast a vote. We will not have had a full board vote on this, even though we're all set for providing our feedback to city planning based on Richard's having solved that earlier. My guess is that I should probably abstain from a vote on this, just because we wouldn't have had a full board vote, and God forbid the resolution should change between now and full board. So those are my points for you guys.
Shelley?
I agree that abstention would be appropriate tomorrow for a number of reasons, but I think you should put it in context, which I'm sure you will, of why it's an abstention and not meant to be a criticism or a negative comment on it.
Yep.
Well, the why it's an abstention is an interesting thing. There are two basic grounds to abstain. Number one, the full board hasn't had an opportunity to review it. And we've barely had an opportunity. We certainly haven't had an opportunity to consult the map and all the other secondary sources. And two, it doesn't really apply to us.
Yeah. Yep.
So maybe I'll lead with that, which is to say that we're abstaining in part because of a timing snafu, but also because this is a text amendment with a 45-day referral to community boards, not a full ULURP with 60 days for us. But the fact that it doesn't, that 100% minus one building or possibly two buildings of our entire district is a public park, kind of boxes us out of the equation in one sense anyway.
And I take it, with respect to Waterline Square, there's practically nothing they can do under this zone. I mean, they're built. They're not going to start moving their mechanicals or.
Although credit where it's due, this was previewed for us by Olive Freud back in about 2010, when she observed that the entrance to the parking garage in what I still refer to as Building 3 would be in the floodplain, and she's exactly right. And here we are. But
okay, so
so we've solved Borough Board. Now you need to make your resolution and include or exclude whatever you want.
Right. Well, I don't know. I think the right move for us is to recommend an abstention on the grounds that we discussed.
Right.
You don't have any strong, yeah.
No, I think that's settled. I think that's exactly what I'm going to do tomorrow morning. Now you have to have a resolution that you're going to bring to full board.
That's what I would bring to the full board.
Yeah, you can do the same thing.
Why?
You could just describe, you could describe for the full board that the applicability is low, and that Riverside Park is part of it, and this being addressed or whatever. I don't know, something about that, perhaps. That's where the vulnerability may lie for mitigation or for I don't know, at least for caution or some planning. But that's part of the.
If we're not going to take a position, then there's no resolution to refer. We simply just don't do anything.
Yeah.
I mean, but somehow that doesn't seem like what we're being asked to do. That I don't know. I mean,
I suppose we could have a resolution that we don't object.
We support the policy goals or something.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
In principle.
Yeah.
Then in principle, we support the goals.
That's fine.
Very simple resolution.
We have to figure out how to get the word squishy into it.
Well, you can consult the other, yeah.
All right, so the resolution is that Community Board 7 approves the underlying goals of the proposed text change, and in view of the fact that none of the proposals deal with buildings in Community Board 7, we take no position on the details of the plan.
Correct.
All those in favor?
Committee members first.
Aye.
I see me.
Aye.
Uh,
This is
I see-
Seema. I'm an I too.
Okay, so 5. Opposed, committee members? None. Abstain? 1. For cause?
Nobody.
Nobody. Yeah, so it's 5-0 to 1 to 0. And now non-committee members. All those in favor? 1, 2, 3. Okay. All those opposed, non-committee,
Yeah.
and abstaining, nobody. Okay.
1.
So, Paige, you're abstaining.
I'm sorry, Paige is abstaining?
As a committee member.
But you're a committee member, aren't you, Paige?
Yes, you are.
Unmute.
You
should have
should have voted earlier.
No, she did.
I thought I was not permitted until Mark put me on the list. I didn't know I was a committee member still.
You
I
are.
think I thought you've always been.
Well, I don't know.
Hey, all right, so you're
I'm sorry,
abstaining.
Glitch.
Yeah.
Can you abstain me on the committee
Yeah.
then?
So
Okay.
it's 5-0 to 2-0,
Was
and
it 2? Okay.
yeah. Well, I think
So was Jeanette. Right,
Jeanette,
okay.
I also abstained.
Got it. Okay.
And on the non-committee, it's 1, 2,
It's
3.
3-0 to 0.
Right. All right. It's
Thanks,
getting a
Nabila.
little. I'm sorry.
We should thank Nabila.
Oh, yes, absolutely. That was a very good presentation.
Extremely.
And I think some of us would still like some of that material. I like this.
I'll-
Now, is your is the PowerPoint available?
Yes, what I'll do is I'll follow up tomorrow and I'll email Richard and Mark the presentation to circulate and the additional information that came up.
Okay, great.
That's
Thank
great.
you.
Thank you.
Jeanette, do you have your hand up for further, or is that leftover?
No, I just wanted to say that the reason I abstain, I mean, I support the work as good work, but I don't agree that CB7 should be so closed-minded, so to speak, that, oh, it doesn't affect us, so we don't have a say in this.
Well, that's
Environmental regulations affect everybody. What we do up on our little hill on the Upper West Side is going to affect our surrounding communities. And I appreciate that Nabila, indicated that other agencies are doing other things, but I do think city planning should be doing more. I think they should curtail, future development that is going to make future flooding worse. And therefore they should be including neighborhoods like ours. But I'm fine with the resolution to,
Yeah, I think the purpose of the purpose of the resolution is to say, look, we agree with the goal
right
of city planning. We are not in a position really to opine about how it applies elsewhere in the city. It would require very close study that we just don't have time for, and there's no real reason for us to do that because it really doesn't affect this community or even any adjoining communities.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. The other thing I wanted to just raise, and I think it's getting a little late, so we don't have to discuss it, is whether we want to take on a project to address commercial, with BCI, to address commercial vacancies and ways and means to reduce them. My impetus was from I don't know if anyone read it, an editorial in the Times a few days ago, which discussed the issue, came up with some ideas, and it just struck me as something that, along with BCI, it might be worthwhile for us to explore. We do it periodically, about every 5 years, but and nobody has come up with a foolproof solution. Doug, did you want to?
I'm happy to discuss it. I'm on BCI, and obviously,
Right.
what I do every single day. So I'm interested to know what ideas you have or what you're thinking about.
Okay, well, let's Mark, maybe through the steering committee, or you can try to make a marriage between us and BCI and figure out a way, if the committee's interested, if the other committee's interested, and if we're interested.
Richard, I
Yeah.
know there's some studies that are being done right now, so we might want to reach out, find some of the studies that are out there, and maybe get a couple of experts and have a joint meeting with BCI sometime in the next, in 2021.
I just got an email while I was sitting here, and this isn't partisan at all. It happens to be from Scott Stringer, and the subject of it is the concern, at least about the difficulties of small businesses and what some of the and the disappearance. And he just has something about some measures that could be addressed. But if you're only looking at the commercial, I'm not sure quite what the focus of what you want to examine.
Well, by the way, the Times editorial does refer to Scott's.
Oh yes, because he's got a proposal. Yeah.
What I don't have any preconceived solution, but the issue, the problems, obviously, the overwhelming problem is vacancy of commercial spaces, but it is tied into the fact that small businesses can't afford rent in these spaces, and so it's a double problem, and to solve it would solve two problems. It would make the streetscape more pleasant, preserve small businesses in our community. One of the things the Times suggested was to have somehow make larger tenants pay higher per square foot rent, and to some extent, in that way, subsidize smaller tenants. I'm not sure how they would do that, but it's an idea that it's similar to the idea of commercial rent control, but and it also seems like an occupancy tax for bigger businesses. But I'm not sure what exactly.
I'm not sure how that relates to land use.
I'm sorry?
Yeah.
I'm not sure how that relates to land use.
I mean, that's also kind of antithetical to what's being proposed to repeal the commercial rent tax. So it's just you add one and take another. The problem is that businesses are going out, and by definition, a larger space pays a tremendous amount of rent just because of the.
Yeah. But look, there may not be a solution, but it's a problem worth looking at.
I would think the question that we really want to try to figure out is how can we make an empty space less lucrative to a developer than an occupied space, regardless of whether the occupied space was a community gallery or a cafe or a store or whatever. Because I think at the end of the day, it's better for a developer to take have the space empty and take a loss in the taxes than to lower the rent. And until that gets solved, I don't see how.
That's not always the problem. Sometimes it's the the landlord has bankers who he's loaned money to, and the bankers are saying, okay, you can't rent this space for X, you have to rent it for X plus Y. And so
Right.
the landlord, I still don't understand how this is a land use issue, but I think we could work on it and figure out how it is a joint issue.
And I'd like to respond to what Jeanette just said. There, for some reason, there's this urban myth going around that landlords like to keep spaces vacant. I work for a lot of landlords, and I can tell you by my constant calls and hammering that that is not the case. They are calling me at all hours of the day. What are you doing? How many showings have you had? Have you reached out to these companies? So, you know, we had a forum last year. I'm not an accountant. There may be some way to do a write-off, you know, but if people are making less income, they're paying less tax, but there's not really advantage to keeping space vacant. If there is, it's very rare. It's you know, there's a lot.
My understanding is that there is a going market amount, and people don't want to go below that amount. And I understand it's the bankers too, but I think that and I don't believe in penalties, but I think if there was some sort of incentive for lowering the rent to have somebody in there, even if it's a month to month, that makes it more attractive from my experience from previous work. It's at the end of the day, it's, you know, developers and landlords will include what is most financially beneficial to them. And somehow we have to make empty space that's been vacant for years. I mean, not just the last couple of months. I understand sometimes it takes longer to fill it, but space that has been vacant for years and years. That
I think at some point, I agree with Roberta that the banks are a major stumbling block. But at some point, it's not in the bank's interest to insist that this stuff be vacant. At some point, these landlords are going to stop paying their mortgage or slow down, and banks are going to stop having people knock on their doors to borrow money. And so as long as there's some reasonable assurance that the landlord can meet his monthly burden, I think at some point the banks have to relent and allow lower rents.
They are.
But sometimes the landlord is working with the, and I think Paige wants to say something, but sometimes the landlord is working with the small store, the owner, and trying to make a deal with them, and they just, the small business person just is fed up and hasn't made the money and is scared and
Sure.
But I think Paige has had her hand up for a while.
Paige?
Doug probably knows about this, but Landmark West has been working very hard with Huntley Gill on the, what is it, from 77th Street down to Lincoln Center. And one of the things we've done is we've renamed 72nd Street Main Street. And what we're trying to do is feature what went here. And they were there. We've got histories and writers and everybody trying to get them out on the street so that they can start recognizing beautiful buildings and buildings that, you know, the renters, the tenants can identify with. And this has now been quite successful. We have art, and Huntley has been doing that. Sean has been finding things. So I think I don't think it's a land use issue because it really is a massive intertwined financial issue. And we don't want to do anything that could put the tenants that are sort of okay at risk. But I think there are some opportunities where the community board can pitch in. And it might be something as dumb as hosting a community board meeting in one of the vacant spaces and inviting people in. You know, use the vacant spaces because we don't really have a meeting place. So those are the things that we're working on, but check out the website because I think Sean has done and Huntley have pulled this out of a rabbit's hat. So you might find it inspiring to lead to other things. That's
it's on
all.
the Landmark West website?
Yes. And there are two things. There's a page called They Were There, And then there's the Main Street. We're working now with Huntley, and I know Doug has been, I don't know if you're directly involved, but we're featuring individual landmarks and histories and encouraging people to talk about their experiences, whether the shop is still there or unfortunately is closed. But it's a lot of fun.
I love to participate in it just because it sounds so exciting. So I know I'm not involved. I know who Huntley is and have great respect for him, but I would love to learn more about it.
Okay, thanks.
I love the idea of an in-person meeting personally, but
In person.
I would just like to add to that, this discussion pre-COVID makes sense, but post-COVID, I think retail has totally turned on its side, and there are land use issues that we could explore to make space more interactive, to allow space to spread out on sidewalks, to encourage people to walk on the sidewalk and to go to places rather than ordering everything online. And I think that's going to be a need regardless of whether a store is operating or not, once our city emerges from it, or our country. And so I'd really like to do more learning before the community board sort of proposed anything.
I agree.
I'd be very happy to help in any way I can. This is literally, I'm soaking in it. It's what I do all day, every day and night.
I invite everybody to do the research. I'll do some research. We'll try to come up with, I know a few years ago, there was a study in San Francisco for.
Yes, that's how I was about to cite that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Also, if I could just echo, I do agree with the points made by Jeanette. And also, each person did offer a provocative and interesting and even learned point. I could only think, as trying to put this together, that before the pandemic, and even before the increase in buying online, we did have examples, however limited, of the vacant stores, even on Broadway, and we would all be speculating, why is it better to keep it vacant and and not fill it in some way? And we never knew the answer. There were many examples, and there was much discussion also in the city council. So it seems to me that some of the points made here by learned people and anecdotally, maybe some work, a little bit of even putting down land use and the BCI committee, because it is both. And it's important to the community board that we put down some of the observations and issues and then see what we can make of it. And it's an important thing to do, and to know more, perhaps in a slightly more systematic way.
I tend to agree with Roberta that probably BCI is the lead committee on this project, because
I definitely think we should do it, Richard. Yeah. I think, and I think we should look at best practices. There may be, yeah. I get stuff from around the country that there may be some cities and towns that have figured out a model that seems to be working. I went last week to buy a present for my granddaughter very reluctantly into a little store that I like. And there was one other person shopping in the store, and I had my mask and, very careful. And they were thrilled to have me there. And the store owner told me that she's going to start having special hours that you can call and have by appointment only and come into the store so you feel safe. I mean, I try and shop locally, but I think there may be models out there that have been very successful, and we should start looking to see where those models are. And I think Scott Stringer is a good place to start too with his study.
Mark, do we have an intern?
No, not this year.
Okay.
I would just add, though, while BCI should be the lead and probably is most knowledgeable, land use has the ability to create the tools that could be implemented, whether zoning,
absolutely,
or elsewhere. So it really should be hand in hand. And then another thing is I don't think we're just, I think looking at best case scenarios, I think the whole world is or at least the Western world is really like struggling with this. I know in England, they create what they call meanwhile spaces. Meanwhile is like in between a occupancy or something. And we've explored that with art shows and other things. But at the end of the day, we have to regroup and rethink post-COVID. People are tired of being home, tired of being out. And so maybe before we looked at sidewalks as don't privatize our sidewalk space with enclosed cafes, but maybe we should be revisiting, how can we have open cafes, open storefronts, how can we find the right balance? And I think there's going to be a lot of different urban sort of institutions, whether it's ULI or whoever, exploring this. And I definitely think that it's timely for us to be involved.
Yeah, I mean, with COVID, there's obviously a reduction in the number of people going to Midtown to go to work in all those big office towers. And if that's the case, those people must be somewhere, and maybe those who reside on the West Side are still here. And it might be an opportunity actually to increase retail here, because the model of, going to work in Midtown and then going to Brooks Brothers or Saks Fifth Avenue in Midtown is no longer as applicable.
No, I think that
right.
you've hit it right on the target. People will want more local options for working out of home, whether that's coffee shops or otherwise, outdoor seating and spaces. And our community could jump ahead by facilitating that.
Richard, your point is well taken, and it is happening in real time. I represent tenants and landlords, do a lot of mom and pops, but I interface with just about every level of tenant and landlord. And in Midtown, the traditional conventional business neighborhoods, because there's such a lower occupancy and higher vacancy in office tenants, people are working from home. Right. And so there are certain businesses that would thrive Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, and then die off in the evenings and weekends because it's not a residential neighborhood. Right. Some of the operators are multi-unit operators, so they actually have, let's say, just for example, Sweet Green is a salad place. They have locations in Midtown. They have locations on the Upper West Side. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying that they've shared their data with me, but there has been an interesting shift in their businesses being dead in Midtown and a little bit of an uptick in the residential because people are home. I'm
sure that's true of the chain of McDonald's and Burger King and.
Right. So in a way, it's actually a little bit good for the residential neighborhoods. It has a bit of a stabilizing effect. It is chilling in the tourist and business areas. They are decimated. But one of the concerns that I have in terms of land use and regulation is almost, there are a few spaces, lovely mom and pop landlords that have been dying to have, let's say, a physical fitness, a gym. And I've talked to Gail about this, and it's not within the zoning. They would have to go through the Board of Standards and Appeals and for a physical culture establishment permit. The big gyms can afford to go through that process and do it. The small ones can't. So the small landlord and the small tenant can't do it, even though that space has been vacant for so long, and I could have rented it 5 times over to a boutique fitness. That's an area of zoning that I think
you hit a pet peeve of mine. I was there at the beginning when this special permit was introduced, and it was introduced solely to prevent what they used to call massage parlors from proliferating in residential areas. That was the only purpose of it. It wasn't to regulate gyms. And they, but they imposed the regulations. You couldn't do massage. You had to do, and you had to get a special permit. It is, occasionally we use it as a way of getting gyms to improve their ventilation or noise or something. But basically, we have no reason to review gyms. I don't think. you know, unless there's a specific issue, a gym is a beneficial use. And I don't think we've ever turned one down, to my knowledge. So I'm with you.
Physical culture establishment.
Right.
Yeah, the PCE.
Well, only
permit-
if they have,
And
only
the
if-
only reason I know that is because I used
Richard,
to
only if they have
represent,
showers, only if they have showers.
It's,
If they
it's,
don't have showers,
right.
then they don't have to go through the land use.
it's
I
a
think
little
we've
more
gotten
than
off
showers.
topic
Showers,
here.
Yeah,
it's not
that's
just
true.
showers, but that's one of the.
Yeah,
So
there's
why don't
one,
why don't we look at this in 2021, which will be
Before
17 or
we know.
18 days from now.
Sounds like
Okay.
you got an agenda for January.
Roberta, I take that as a motion to adjourn.
I do.
Thank you. All
All those in
Okay.
Sorry,
favor?
everybody.
I know
Good to see
Jeanette's gonna.
Everybody
abstain.
be well, be safe, happy
Happy
holidays.
Hanukkah.
Happy
New
holiday.
Year, Happy
Merry-
holidays.
Merry-
Happy
Safe in the
Happy
snow.
New Year.
Excellent. Thank you all.
All right,
And,
bye-bye.
happy inauguration.